Hello, I am James O'Driscoll, a research fellow from the University of Aberdeen, and I'm going to tell you about our recent excavations at Tappanoth, Hillfort in western Aberdeenshire. These excavations are part of the Comparative Kingship project at the university, whose broader aim really is to investigate the development of early medieval kingdoms in northern Britain and Ireland. As part of this project, we've been investigating some of Scotland's most iconic sites, none more so spectacular than Tappanoth, a massive 16-hectare site surrounding hundreds of hut platforms and a vitrified oblong fort at the summit. And the slide here shows the complex really well. You can see the oblong fort here at the summit, and then the much larger outer rampart of the 16-hectare fort, and then some smaller divots in the interior representing hut platforms, and even some linear features here probably representing some of the trackways that serviced these hut platforms. Of course, typically these oblong forts are thought to date to the Middle Iron Age, with the larger Hillfort being interpreted either very early in the Hillfort sequence to the late Bronze Age, or at the very end to around the Roman Iron Age. So you might be wondering why a project that focuses on the early medieval period is investigating a site that is probably prehistoric. And the answer to that is the nearby enclosure of Barflat and Riney, which you can see here in the slide, the grass-stained symbol stone marking the entrance to the enclosure, with Tappanoth Hillfort seen quite prominently in the distance in the background. Barflat has been the focus of excavations by the university for nearly a decade and has been securely dated to the 4th to 6th century AD, with an incredible assemblage of high-status metalworking as well as imported Roman pottery and glass, attesting to the importance of the site. Close by are a contemporary cemetery and another small fort that we're working on called Cairnmore. So the landscape of Riney really shows a relatively dense cluster of early medieval sites, particularly when we consider that there is such a dearth of settlement evidence from this period in Scotland. So the premise for investigations at Tappanoth was that the Hillfort is such a prominent topographical feature in the background with upstanding ancient features that the elites associated with the Barflat enclosure complex may have reused the site, repurposing the monument as a way of legitimating their power and status. And a similar scenario seems to have taken place at a very similar vitrified oblong fort in Craigfradrig overlooking Inverness, which revealed an internal structure with early medieval pottery and other artifacts from the Mediterranean and associated metalworking, as well as reuse of the bank of the oblong fort itself, which dated to the early medieval period. And specifically at Tappanoth, within the interior of the vitrified oblong fort, there are two curious U-shaped banks here that you can see on the LiDAR and photogrammetry results, which we thought potentially could be later in date and possibly dating to the Pictish period or the beginning of the early medieval period. So we began our investigations of the site in 2017 within the oblong fort in the summit, which tried to more comprehensively date the vitrified fort as well as the two U-shaped banks within the interior. And this is only the second recorded excavation at the site, the first being undertaken by James MacDonald in the 19th century, which really didn't produce any artifacts that could date the site. And from the slide here you can really see the massive undertaking such a dig entails. The amount of stone used in the wall, which stand to over 3 meters in high in places, with an apron of collapsed stone around the exterior, really implies that the fort, when it was first built, must have been an incredible site, with the walls standing 5 or 6 meters high at least. So Tappanoth is one of a cluster of these vitrified oblong forts found in northeastern Scotland, with other examples such as Finabin, Craigfradrig, Dunderdle, Castlelaw, and so on, revealing evidence that they were broadly built and destroyed in the Middle Iron Age around 400 to 100 BC, with less secure thermoluminescence and archaeomagnetic dating programs at some of these sites broadly supporting this dating. In fact, In one of these archaeometric studies, Tapanoth was used as a case study, and it broadly placed the destruction of the site around the end of the first millennium BC, but nothing more condensed or narrow of a date other than that. So our first season looked at the wall of the oblong fort, and this was a bit of an eye-opener, with long days of stone shifting, removing overburden to get to any sort of datable layers. But eventually we got there, and this revealed the very fragile inner wall face, which incredibly still survived a height of about 1.8 meters. And it was composed of heat shattered and cracked stones, and we found evidence that some of these stones were just beginning to be vitrified, so droplets of vitrified material were adhering to some of these stones. You can actually see some of the drops running down the face of some of these stones here in the picture. There was no sign of any mass vitrification that you can see in other parts of the fort. In places, small voids in the wall face may represent evidence for timber lacing, but again the destruction was so severe that no real pattern could be identified. The wall face itself held back a core of much smaller angular stone, so the wall originally probably would have looked like two inner and outer wall faces tied together with wooden beams, and then this was filled with loose stone in between the two faces. And the basal course of the wall stones survived in situ, and notably these did not appear heat affected and remained largely intact. And if you look at this photo closely, you can actually see a dark charcoal rich deposit which had big bits of animal bone and burnt bone intermixed with it. And importantly, this abutted the unburnt basal stones of the fort, and was not intermixed with any collapsed material, suggesting it formed when the fort itself was being used. And above this then, we discovered a series of destruction layers with pockets of charcoal and large fragments of animal bone, possibly suggesting the destruction of the fort coincided with a feasting event. And all of this was fantastic dating evidence for us. And while these layers extended into the interior, very little else in the way of occupation or activity were identified. A part of one of the U-shaped banks was sectioned in this trench, and while we could see that much of the wall collapse associated with the vitrified fort sits on top of the U-shaped bank, suggesting it could be broadly contemporary, there was no other stratigraphic relationship between it and the vitrified fort. It was not really until our second season in 2018 that we began to reveal more substantial evidence for activity within the interior. On the western side of the fort, we opened another trench in order to recover more dating evidence, and this time we revealed much more complex archaeology. The wall of the fort on this side was heavily vitrified, with the red you see in the image here consisting of huge pieces of vitrified rock, which were also depicted in the photograph here. So sitting underneath the limits of a series of wall collapse events and smaller fragments of vitrified rock, we found the remains of the wall face, depicted here as the grey area in the section. This survived to a height of 5 courses and comprised of flat slabs of stone with a number of rectangular voids you can see here, representing places where wooden beams would have tied the wall faces together. So a much more complete picture of what was emerging in our 2017 trench. However, here we also revealed some good evidence for activity within the interior in the form of a compact blue clay floor layer that abutted this wall face. And this survived underneath a destruction layer showing evidence for occupation of the fort before the site was destroyed by fire. Further into the interior, we sectioned the 2 U-shaped banks here and here. The outermost of these was cut into the blue clay floor layer and therefore is later in date and may have acted as a footing for a wooden palisade. Now we're not quite sure yet what the function of this palisade was, or the U-shaped banks in general, but it could have been used as a revetment for the collapsing wall of the vitrified oblong fort, or a later elaboration of the defences. But as we shall see in a few slides, there is no clear difference between the dating of this feature and that of the fort, or indeed any of the features within the interior, all of which date to around 400 to 100 BC. At the same time, as Trench 2 was moving along nicely, excavation of a large area at the highest part of the interior was also taking place, and unfortunately we had very little luck here other than a patch of heat-affected clay, or heat-affected silt at the centre of the trench. A more fruitful trench was the southeast part of the fort. We investigated the well, which had previously been dug by MacDonald in the 19th century, but fortunately MacDonald had only dug a shaft down the very centre of the well around here, leaving much of the sides of the deposit intact, and as well the very base of the well intact, so great for dating evidence for us. The well itself measured around 1.7 metres in depth and cut through natural deposits, with the base also being rock cut. So thanks to funding from Historical Environment Scotland, we have very comprehensively dated this vitrified fort and the associated internal activity. And here you can see the results of one of the most consistent, if not slightly boring, set of radiocarbon dates that I have ever seen. Over 40 dates showing that construction and destruction of the fort and all related internal activity dates around 400 to 100 BC. And unfortunately, from our perspective, there was no obvious indication of any form of reuse during the early medieval period. But from a prehistorian and a Hillfort enthusiast point of view, this was a very informative excavation. Tappernoth is now the most comprehensively dated oblong fort in Scotland. We can link all of the activity within the interior to the Iron Age, with possible use of the fort before its destruction in the form of floor layers abutting unburnt inner wall facing, and use of the fort after its destruction, possibly with the construction of the U-shaped banks. We see similar evidence at Finabin, the laws of Montefief in Aberdeenshire, Dundeerdle in the Highlands, for floor layers abutting the inner wall face of these oblong forts, though there is less evidence for any occupation at the centre. And again, a lot of these oblong forts show very similar characteristics in that they have no clear entrance. They really adhere to this oblong or elongated oval shape, and now we're seeing broader trends such as occupation abutting the wall faces rather than the interior of some of these sites. But at Tappernoth we also see more tentative evidence for the rituals that may have been associated with the destruction and vitrification of the fort, with possible feasting taking place within the site while this was happening. And similar evidence again has been found at Castlelaw in Perthshire, Finabin, and so on, where excavations found numerous burnt and unburnt bones close to the inner wall face of each fort. So this is a key element of the excavations really, because when we think about the resources and number of people that would have been needed to start and maintain the fires to vitrify the wall of Tappernoth and any other oblong fort, then we can clearly see this is a well thought out communal process, and that image, the image produced for the Dundeerdle publication up here shown in the slide, is a great visual to show what the process might have looked like. While the reasons for the destruction of the fort are still a mystery, was it for defence, ritual decommissioning, a punitive action by a rival group, or so on, we now know a bit more about the social processes that took place as it happened. So, our most recent season in 2019 focused on the large outer fort and hut platforms that surrounded this summit oblong fort. Now, rather than expecting these features to be Pictish, this last season was undertaken more to round out our study and investigation of the site, as we believed, like most other researchers, that these features would date to around the Late Bronze Age or Roman Iron Age. Neither The outer fort or any of the hut platforms have been excavated before, and it was not until 1999, when the Royal Commission completed a plan of the site, shown here, that an accurate map of the large fort and platforms were recorded. This identified 10 breaks in the perimeter of the fort, as well as trackways, hundreds of platforms, many of these previously identified by Ian Ralston in the 1980s. But our LiDAR and photogrammetry surveys have revealed a far more dense and complex internal settlement. You can see on the image here the pot marking visible in the interior of the fort, which shows up to 808 possible circular hut platforms, a massive increase from the 234 identified by Ian Ralston. The survey showed that most of the interior was densely settled, although there are a number of places on the western side, for example, where the slope was very severe, and there's little sign of any evidence here. We can see from the density map on the right that there are clusters of more densely populated areas, and while in some instances this reflects the local topographical situation, there is also a tentative pattern that emerges here. We see large clusters of average-sized hut platforms, generally in the region of 60 meters in diameter, with larger platforms, which are much less common, located at the edge of these groups. Amazingly, there is not a single platform that seems to truncate another, and there are various examples of lines or rows of platforms which follow the trackways within the interior, all of which suggest that most of these platforms could be broadly contemporary. As Ian Narmit notes in his Celtic Scotland book, once platforms were built, they could have been reused by later generations, but since the construction of a second platform implies that someone was still occupying the first, the construction of several hundred implies that, at certain times at least, very large numbers of people occupied the hill. Now obviously the chronology of these structures is a key issue, and one which we hope not to solve, but certainly alleviate with excavations of many more platforms in the future. But for the moment, if we accept that this cluster of platforms could be broadly contemporary, we see a strikingly similar pattern in some of the large, densely populated hill forts of southern Britain, such as Maiden Castle, Hod Hill, Hamilton Hill, for example, where dense settlement is imposed upon a dendritic trackway system similar to Tappanath. At Hod Hill, dense clusters of structures delimited by the trackways were discovered by geophysical survey, which each group associated with one or two large structures located at the edge of each cluster. And this led Stewart and Russell to argue that such a layout indicates that the hill fort was inhabited by a series of kin groups who clustered together in certain parts of the hill fort, with heads of each group being distinguished by building larger structures at the edge of each cluster. So certainly looking at the pattern of platforms at Tappanath, a similar kin-based model might be applicable here. Of course, most of the comparable southern British examples probably date to around 100 BC, so our excavations to date, the large enclosure at Tappanath and some of the internal platforms were vitally important in our understanding of the site, regardless of if there was any indication of early medieval activity like we had hoped. Unfortunately, we found some fantastic archaeology in these trenches, both in terms of the artefacts we discovered and samples we retrieved for dating. Trench 7 was positioned over an entrance in the outer enclosure at the northern side of the fort, and this revealed a terminal of the entrance, showing the enclosure to comprise a 4.5 metre wide unstructured stone rampart, roughly delimited by a series of larger curving stones. Underneath this was a possible palisade cut, suggesting that the low stone rampart could have acted as a footing for a wooden palisade. And there were no features identified within the entrance, such as gate posts or any type of structural features, though a floor surface abutted the inner side of the rampart on the southwestern side, just about here. This surface is important though, as it shows that there may be many more structures or occupation floors within the interior that we simply cannot see on the surface, which suggests that there actually may be even more than the 808 possible platforms that we have identified with our LiDAR and photogrammetry surveys. Within the interior, Trench 5 investigated a platform near the vitrified oblong fort, but unfortunately we ran out of time with this one, so we only managed to expose the upper surfaces and excavate 2 narrow sondages on either side to obtain some dating evidence. Fortunately, we had much better luck with Trench 6, and within a few hours of deturfing and cleaning, we had already exposed 2 hearths, some possible post holes, and an upper occupation surface. The 2 hearths you can see in the early photo here, and some of the post holes. All of this was fantastic for dating, although the pottery from the hearth and upper floor surface already gave us a good idea that this hut platform dated to around the Roman Iron Age. Some really nice pieces of Roman pottery from the site. And crucible and mould fragments showed that the platform was used for more than just habitation, with fantastic bits of pin molds being found in the hearths. And after spotting these artefacts, our finds expert Dan McLean immediately suggested they looked similar to those from the early medieval enclosure at Barflat nearby, but of course we completely disregarded this because the site was prehistoric, we told ourselves. But how wrong we were, and it's amazing how many people have told us since that they knew Tappanacht was an early medieval fort, but no one really did, and that's why this is such an incredible find, a find so important that it will help us to rewrite the narrative of this period of Scottish history. The results all came back as 3rd to 6th century AD, or the very beginning of the Roman Iron Age, or at the very end of the Roman Iron Age and beginning of the early medieval period. Samples directly underneath the rampart and the palisade of the large fort dated to the 4th to 6th century AD, and as such is broadly contemporary with the Barflat enclosure in Riney. While dates from all the occupation surfaces and internal hut platforms date to around the 3rd to 6th century AD. So the large outer fort at Tappanacht and at least some of the internal settlement was constructed at a time when Barflat was also being used. And just as Barflat is shown to have multiple phases of use, the first starting as a bivalve enclosure, then later evolving into an elaborate wooden fort, so too does Tappanacht, with multiple floor layers and 2 hearths discovered in the structure at Trench 6. But this new dating brings about important questions regarding the function of other contemporary forts in the area, such as Barflat, Cairnmore and Tappanacht itself. Is Tappanacht the town to Barflat's ritual centre, with Cairnmore being a kingly residence? So still lots more questions to answer. Another central question is the idea of Tappanacht as an urban centre. So the Hillfort itself is now the largest known early medieval hill fort in Britain, and probably one of the largest known in Western Europe. Its internal settlement represents one of the largest collection of ancient hut platforms in Britain, and if many of these are early medieval, like we have suggested they may be above, it also would be one of the largest native early medieval settlements known in Britain and Western Europe outside of any of the Roman towns. We do not get this scale of settlement in Scotland until the 12th century, so hundreds of years after Tappanacht is actually constructed and used. Obviously only 2 of the 808 possible hut platforms have been excavated, and this represents a tiny fraction of the total settlement. But as we suggested, topographical analysis suggests they could be broadly contemporary. If this is the case, we have now gone from knowing about only a small few early medieval houses in Scotland to having nearly 1,000. But many questions remain regarding the use of these structures and the function of Tappanacht itself. Was this truly a town? Was it a seasonal settlement? Or was it an assembly place for a disparate group scattered throughout the local landscape? And probably the most important question, in my opinion, is what prompted the construction of this site? Something so completely different to what seems to have gone before. And is Tappanacht unique? If it is unique, can it really help us to understand the development of early medieval societies in Britain? And I would think yes it can, because looking at the broader picture in northern Britain, Tappanacht actually is not as unique as it seems. Tapanath is actually one of a handful of very large hilltop forts in northern Britain, with many of these also having very dense internal settlements. An excellent example of this is Eildon Hill in the Scottish borders. Here another massive fort, the largest hilltop fort in northern Britain at nearly 19 hectares, surrounds 296 recorded hut platforms. The fort itself comprises a massive triple rampart enclosure surrounding the entire summit, as well as another enclosure on the upper plateau and a possible third one here identified by the Royal Commission. Now, Owen excavated some of these in the 1980s, but only the inner bank, this one here of the outer enclosing element, produced any dating evidence, and unfortunately this dating is not very clear cut. Late Bronze Age dates were retrieved from pits directly underneath the rampart, suggesting to the excavator this site was built around this period. However, Roman artefacts dating to the 2nd to 4th century AD were also discovered in the rampart, but the excavator dismissed these as residual material associated with modern disturbance. Also, she excavated 3 platforms within the interior, which showed signs that some platforms were originally occupied in the late Bronze Age, but strikingly all of the excavated platforms show signs of reuse in the Roman Iron Age, and indeed some of them actually seem to have been constructed newly in this later period. Most of the stray finds from the interior of the fort date to the 2nd to 4th century AD, and a Roman signal station at the very summit of the fort, excavated in the 1950s, also suggests Roman occupation or Roman associations and activity at this time. And the actual signal station itself may suggest that the interior was somewhat linked with the nearby Roman fort of Trimontium to the northeast of the fort itself. And our photogrammetry surveys at the site have actually showed a much more complex series of enclosing elements and nearly double the number of recorded hut platforms. Analysis of this settlement shows a strikingly similar pattern to Tapanath in terms of clustering and the position of larger platforms at the edges of these groups. And while the date of the fort remains to be clarified by excavation, the survey shows that the inner rampart of the outer enclosure here, actually, which has 2nd to 4th century AD artifacts from it, may not be the final phase of Hillfort construction. You can see here this inner rampart cuts through this summit fort, but then the outer 2 ramparts actually bulge out to avoid it, suggesting that this rampart, which may date to the 2nd to 4th century AD, has another phase of activity after it's been constructed. So potentially we have late Roman, Iron Age, and even early medieval activity and construction of hill forts going on here. Of course, this is very tentative, and we need more excavation at the site to create a more robust outline chronology. But certainly Eildon Hill has the potential to prove to be a pivotal monument in the understanding of development of late Iron Age and early medieval societies. As here, the little evidence we do have suggests part of the fort and some of the internal settlements may have been constructed a century or 2 earlier than Tapanath. And there are other examples of these large, densely occupied hill forts in northern Britain that show tentative but tantalising evidence for activity in this later period. Even further afield, looking at the famous hill fort at Evering Bell in Northumberland, we see possible evidence for a similar phasing. Evering Bell is traditionally seen as an Iron Age tribal centre, though some also suggest the site may date to the Bronze Age, very like Tapanath. It consists of a single rampart of stone enclosing an area of just over 6 hectares with a central palisade enclosure surrounding a small area at the eastern summit. The fort surrounds a total of 125 recorded hut platforms. The site itself was excavated on a number of occasions, most famously by Hope Taylor in the 1950s, who hoped the hill fort would be an immediate precursor to the Anglo-Saxon royal settlement at the northern base of the hill. Unfortunately, Hope Taylor was disappointed by the results of the excavation and never fully published them, and the archive was eventually lost. So we have no radiocarbon dates for the site, but the artifactual assemblage that we know of is incredibly interesting. The little information we do know about the excavations have recently been compiled by Roger and Mikett, and this shows activity within the interior of Evering Bell during the 2nd, 3rd and 4th centuries AD, with some Roman coins and shards of Roman pottery suggesting a possible chronology similar to that of Eildon Hill and possibly even Tapanoth. So looking at the results of the photogrammetry survey, which has again identified dozens of new platforms, we see the same density and layout of internal settlement. Here again we have another large, densely populated hill fort that shows activity during this period, and certainly more dating evidence for the site would be very welcome. And then we have other sites like Traprain Law, which has seen several excavation campaigns over the centuries, and one of the largest enclosures on the summit of Traprain, the Crudin Wall, which may be about 12 hectares in size, possibly dates to the 3rd to 5th century AD, and this surrounds a dense internal settlement identified through excavation, though the settlement itself it's not really clear what this dates to. And very similar to Eildon Hill, there's extensive evidence for both late Bronze Age and Roman Iron Age activity at this site, and this makes things that bit more complex. Unfortunately, this is the state of things really when it comes to these large, densely occupied hill forts in northern Britain. While there are other examples that are comparable to Tapanoth, those that have been excavated are not securely dated. Other undated sites like Old Falden Hill, Northumberlandshire, or Hulme Law in the Scottish borders also show similar patterns of dense internal settlement. And while excavation is needed at these sites to clarify the chronology of the forts and the hut platforms, we see very tentative but also very tantalizing evidence for a completely new late Roman Iron Age early medieval settlement record, with these very large, densely populated hill forts at the core of these societies. And this certainly has the potential to develop into another big, high-impact project in the future. But while our work at Tapanoth has only just begun to reveal the importance of the site and potentially the importance of other large, densely populated hill forts in northern Britain, it is already clear that the results of these excavations and surveys will have a profound effect on the way we think about early medieval societies in northern Britain. But specifically with Tapanoth and mining in general, we now have an incredible complex and densely used early medieval landscape, with the massive fort of Tapanoth at its core. Of course, there are still many questions to answer and lots of work for us to do, but even at this point it is clear that Tapanoth is now potentially one of the most important sites in northern Britain in terms of our understanding of how early medieval societies and kingdoms developed. So thank you for listening, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to give me an email or keep up to date with what's going on in the project at our Facebook page, Northern Picks. So thank you very much.